It had been days, and they still hadn't found the buried treasure. A church member had come to the First Presidency claiming he was the only person who knew about a treasure buried in a home in Salem, Massachusetts. Desperate for financial relief from the church's debt, Joseph, Sidney, and a few other elders joined the search for the money. Now, as strange as this all sounds, the truth is that pirates in previous centuries had buried treasure all along the east coast of America, and hunting for it in the 1800s wasn't uncommon. This treasure hunt, however, was a bust. Okay, the church was in major debt from building the Kirtland Temple. Payments were coming due, and they hoped this trip to Salem could relieve some of this burden. Unfortunately, before they left, they hadn't consulted with the Lord. But after failing to find treasure, they then asked him what they should do. Surprisingly, he revealed, "I, the Lord, am not displeased with your coming on this journey, notwithstanding your follies." Gratefully, God doesn't beat us up if we make flawed decisions, and he can turn our follies into fruits. In section 111, the Lord promised, "I have much treasure in this city for you, for the benefit of Zion," meaning the people in Salem who would eventually join the church. Now, another way Joseph and Sidney tried to relieve the church's debt was through the then common practice of starting a bank, which they called the Kirtland Safety Society. Unfortunately, the nationwide bank panic of 1837, combined with dissenters actively seeking the bank's demise, caused it to fail. 200 investors, including Joseph and Sidney, lost nearly everything they'd invested. Even though the Kirtland Safety Society wasn't owned by the church, it was started by church leaders, and many considered it the church's bank. So, naturally, they blamed Joseph and Sidney for its failure and their personal losses. Many felt that as a prophet, he should have foreseen this problem and saved them from harm. From this point on, some leaders began calling him a fallen prophet, and sadly, many left the church. And so, in section 111, the Lord promises Joseph, "Concern not yourselves about your debt, for I will give you power to pay them." Part of the Lord's plan was to send missionaries to England to gather more saints who'd strengthen the church in many ways. Now, while in the temple, the Lord prompted Joseph to whisper to Heber C. Kimball, "Go to England and proclaim my gospel and open the door of salvation to that nation." How would you like to receive your mission call that way? Oh, Brother Kimball, Orson Hyde, and others left on this epic mission, and upon arrival 1.5 months later, began preaching at a church in Preston, England. A few people in that congregation had seen these American missionaries in their dreams before they arrived in England, and were totally ready to be baptized. They were so ready that they had a foot race to the River Ribble to be the first to be baptized. This mission jump-started church growth by thousands, not just by hundreds. Meanwhile, back in Missouri, Thomas B. Marsh, the president of the 12, learned that the First Presidency was calling apostles on missions to England without consulting him. He felt he was in charge of the 12 and angrily traveled to Kirtland to speak to the prophet. Luckily, Joseph was able to help Thomas understand that God was ultimately in charge. Then the Lord gave section 112 to lovingly chasten Marsh and teach him about priesthood organization. Thomas softened his heart and turned to the Lord. Regrettably, however, church history proves that Thomas had real pride and anger issues, which eventually led him to leave the church and send an inflammatory letter to Governor Lilburn Boggs that sparked the infamous extermination order of all saints from Missouri. As problems with the mobs in Missouri increased, 3 church members were taken captive near Crooked River and sentenced to death. Tragically, while attempting to rescue the saints, Apostle David W. Patton was killed. Now, months before his death, Elder Patton was told in section 114 to sell his store and prepare for a mission. He got his things in order, but was killed before he could leave on the mission. However, since he'd obeyed this revelation, his wife had the money she needed to continue living without him. So, did the revelation about Elder Patton's mission get fulfilled? Yes, but not the way most expected. Over in England, Anne Booth, a newly baptized saint, told Brigham Young and John Taylor about a vision she'd had wherein she saw the recently martyred American apostle David Patton. In the vision, she was carried away to the place of departed spirits, where she beheld this apostle standing at the door of a prison holding a key, which he then used to unlock the door and went in, and followed closely behind. Inside, John Wesley, the English religious reformer, greeted David with a shout of praise and announced to those surrounding him, "Deliverance has come!" With the entire assembly watching, Patton preached baptism and confirmation. Then, Anne saw the heavenly prisoners get baptized, including her family. This vision was a preview of baptisms for the dead, soon to be taught by Joseph Smith, and the preaching of the gospel in the spirit world. So, Elder Patton did serve a mission, but it was on the other side of the veil. Next time, the church flees persecution in Kirtland and moves to far west. We hope you enjoyed this presentation.